Caitlin Clark is already known as one of the most electrifying scorers college basketball has ever produced. But what happened inside a recent USA basketball training camp practice left even the most decorated veterans in the sport completely stunned. The gym that day was filled with champions, players who had spent a decade or more dominating professional basketball, Olympians who had seen every kind of highlight imaginable. Yet when Clark stepped onto the floor for a routine drill, the entire atmosphere changed in a way nobody expected. At first it seemed like a normal sequence, a pass off a screen, a defender closing space, teammates rotating through the drill. But in a split second, Clark executed a pump fake, froze the defender twice, stepped back to a distance most players wouldn't even attempt in a game, and released a shot from near the logo with a motion so effortless it looked almost casual. The ball barely touched the net. The gym erupted for half a second. Then something unusual happened. It went completely quiet. Not the normal quiet of practice concentration, but that rare silence that occurs when elite athletes realize they just witnessed something outside the limits of what they expected. Some players stopped mid-movement. One veteran reportedly put her hands on her hips and just stared, shaking her head in disbelief. Because it wasn't just the shot, it was what came next. Clark did it again, on the very next possession. And then again. 4 straight deep logo shots during a structured drill that coaches normally design to eliminate exactly that kind of attempt. Suddenly the reactions around the gym were impossible to hide. These were professionals who rarely show emotion in practice, women who have competed against legends and played on Olympic stages, yet their body language said everything. The shock wasn't about one highlight. It was about realizing the range, confidence, and audacity Clark brings might completely change how defenses are forced to play the game. What made the moment even more surreal was that this wasn't Clark at her peak. She was still early in her professional development, still adjusting to the physicality and speed of the pro level after her historic college career at the University of Iowa, where she shattered records that once seemed untouchable, including the all-time NCAA scoring mark previously held by Pete Maravich. By the time she entered the league as the #1 pick for the Indiana Fever, she had already become more than a player. She had become an event. Arenas started selling out. Television numbers surged. Entire cities scheduled watch parties just to see what she might do next. And that is the deeper twist behind the stunned reactions in that practice gym. The veterans weren't just witnessing an impossible shot. They were witnessing the growing realization that Clark's style, popularity, and fearless range might reshape the economics and attention surrounding the entire sport. In a league that had long fought for mainstream recognition, her arrival triggered a surge in viewership, sponsorship interest, and media attention that executives and analysts had struggled to generate for years. So when those Team USA veterans paused and watched Clark launch those impossible shots, the moment carried a strange mixture of admiration, disbelief, and perhaps a quiet understanding that the future of the game might be arriving faster, and from farther away on the court, than anyone had anticipated. The truth behind the $2 billion media deal surrounding the WNBA is something that many insiders quietly acknowledge, but rarely say out loud. That number does not exist in a vacuum. It exists largely because of one player, Caitlin Clark. Inside the negotiation rooms where owners, network executives, and sponsors discuss the future of women's basketball, everyone understood the same reality. The surge in attention, the exploding television ratings, the packed arenas, and the wave of new corporate interest were all tied to a single phenomenon: Clark's arrival in professional basketball. When that kind of financial gravity centers around one athlete, every dynamic inside the league begins to shift. What might normally look like a straightforward labor negotiation suddenly becomes far more complicated. Publicly, the Women's National Basketball Players Association framed the potential strike and labor standoff as a fight for better pay, improved working conditions, housing guarantees, and a fair share of the league's revenue. On the surface, those arguments carried legitimate weight. Historically, compensation in women's sports has lagged behind the value many athletes bring to their leagues. Few reasonable observers dispute that players deserve a stronger financial position as the sport grows. But beneath the surface, the dynamics driving the standoff were more complicated than they initially appeared. Reports emerging from within the league suggested that the most aggressive push for a strike was not coming from younger players trying to establish their careers, but from veteran stars who had spent more than a decade building the league into what it is today. Many of those veterans had carried women's basketball through years when television ratings were modest, sponsorships were limited, and financial stability was far from guaranteed. To them, the sudden surge of money and attention represented something they had fought for throughout their entire careers. Yet the timing created a complicated tension. Clark had just finished a rookie season that fundamentally altered the public visibility of the league. Despite entering a professional environment that was faster, stronger, and significantly more physical than college basketball, she still emerged as the most watched player in the sport. Her games generated record viewership numbers, arenas filled up when her team visited opposing cities, and sponsors who had ignored the league for years suddenly wanted partnerships. That momentum was expected to accelerate dramatically as she entered her second professional season, fully adapted to the speed and physicality of the pro game. Within that context, the possibility of a labor stoppage carried enormous implications. A canceled or shortened season would not simply delay games. It would interrupt the momentum that had begun transforming the league's national visibility. For veterans whose careers were nearing their later stages, the financial negotiations represented one final opportunity to reshape the structure of the sport they had helped sustain. For younger players trying to build their reputations and secure contracts, the prospect of losing a season meant lost income and lost development. That internal tension created a complicated dynamic within the players' union itself. While some leaders pushed for a strong negotiating stance, others reportedly sought a quicker resolution that would allow the league to capitalize on the surge in attention surrounding Clark and the broader growth of women's basketball. At the same time, another storyline was quietly unfolding on a different stage. While the labor dispute dominated headlines, Clark arrived at a training camp run by USA Basketball. Her presence there appeared routine on the surface. Elite players regularly participate in national team camps as part of Olympic preparation cycles. But the timing carried symbolic weight. While the professional league navigated internal negotiations and media debates, Clark simply stepped onto the court and played. She avoided public statements about the labor dispute, refrained from criticizing fellow players, and did not insert herself into the political side of the situation. Instead, she did what had made her a global sports figure in the first place. She played basketball at an extraordinary level. Footage from that training camp quickly spread across social media platforms. Clips showing Clark launching deep-range shots and executing difficult plays during practice drew enormous online engagement. What made those clips especially striking was not only the skill involved, but the reactions from other elite players watching her perform. Veterans who had spent years competing at the highest levels of international basketball were visibly surprised by the confidence and range she displayed. The moment captured something larger than a single highlight. It reflected the way Clark's playing style was stretching traditional expectations about spacing and offensive creativity in the sport. For network executives and sponsors observing the situation from a business perspective, the implications were significant. The media value attached to women's basketball was increasingly tied to audience demand, and Clark had demonstrated a unique ability to draw that audience across multiple platforms. Whether through college tournaments, professional games, or international competitions, viewers consistently tuned in to watch her play. That kind of cross-platform visibility gave broadcasters confidence that the interest surrounding her performances extended beyond any single league structure. If the professional season encountered delays, the global stage of international basketball still provided opportunities for audiences to follow her career. As negotiations within the league continued, the broader market was sending a clear signal. The audience response to Clark's games had already reshaped expectations for women's basketball viewership. Television networks wanted to broadcast her performances. Sponsors wanted their brands associated with her rise. Arena attendance surged whenever her team appeared. In sports economics, those patterns are powerful indicators of value. They influence contract negotiations, media rights discussions, and long-term investment strategies across an entire league. None of this diminishes the contributions of the veteran players who spent years sustaining women's professional basketball during periods of lower visibility. Athletes like Diana Taurasi, Brianna Stewart, and Aya Wilson helped establish the competitive excellence and cultural credibility of the sport long before its recent surge in mainstream attention. Their careers laid the foundation upon which the current era is being built. But sports history often moves in waves. At certain moments, a new generation emerges that captures the public imagination in a way that dramatically accelerates a sport's growth. Clark's rise appears to represent one of those moments. Her record-breaking college career at the University of Iowa introduced millions of new viewers to women's basketball, and her transition into the professional ranks continued that momentum. Whether through her long-range shooting, creative passing, or competitive confidence, she has become a central figure in the modern narrative of the sport. When she stepped onto the court at the national team training camp and delivered the kind of performances that quickly went viral online, it reinforced a broader perception spreading among fans, broadcasters, and sponsors alike. Women's basketball had entered a new era of visibility. Eventually, the labor negotiations, media debates, and financial restructuring within the league will reach their conclusions. Collective bargaining agreements get renegotiated, revenue models evolve, and leagues adjust to new economic realities. But the underlying momentum that has brought women's basketball into a new level of global attention is unlikely to disappear. When the next professional season begins, whether immediately or after a delay, the audience that discovered the sport during Clark's historic rise will still be there, and perhaps even larger than before. In that sense, the moment captured during that Team USA practice carried a symbolic meaning beyond a few remarkable shots. It represented a turning point in perception. The veterans watching in silence were not just reacting to an impressive play, they were witnessing the sport entering a new chapter. The future of women's basketball will include many stars, many storylines, and many competitive rivalries. Yet at this particular moment in time, one player has become the focal point through which millions of fans are experiencing the game. And every time Caitlin Clark steps onto the court, that reality becomes clearer. The ripple effects of that moment inside the USA basketball training gym did not end when the drill finished or when the practice session wrapped up. In many ways, that brief stretch of unbelievable shooting from Caitlin Clark became a symbol of a much larger shift taking place across the entire landscape of women's basketball. For years, the WNBA had operated within a very specific reality. It was respected by basketball purists and by the athletes who competed in it, but it existed somewhat on the margins of the larger sports economy. Television ratings were steady but modest, sponsorship interest was limited, and the league often relied on long-term support and partnership with the National Basketball Association to maintain stability during periods of financial uncertainty. None of this meant the product on the court lacked quality. The league was filled with extraordinary talent, world champions, Olympic gold medalists, and some of the most fundamentally sound basketball ever played. But attention, visibility, and commercial momentum never quite matched the level of skill on display. Then something unusual happened over the course of a single college career. Long before Clark ever arrived in the professional ranks, the phenomenon surrounding her performances at the University of Iowa had already begun changing how audiences interacted with women's basketball. Viewership numbers during major college games surged to levels that surprised even media executives who had been tracking sports ratings for decades. Social media clips featuring Clark's deep three-pointers, no-look passes, and fearless shot selection spread across platforms normally dominated by highlights from the men's game. The conversation slowly shifted from curiosity to genuine anticipation. Fans weren't just acknowledging her skill, they were scheduling time to watch her play. By the time she entered the professional league, that anticipation had reached a level rarely seen for any rookie in the history of the sport. When the Indiana Fever selected Clark with the first overall pick, it felt less like a standard draft decision and more like the beginning of a new chapter for the league itself. Almost immediately, arenas began filling with fans who had never attended a WNBA game before. Television partners reported spikes in viewership whenever Indiana appeared on the schedule. Road games that once struggled to sell tickets suddenly became major events because fans wanted the chance to see Clark perform in person. In city after city, the same pattern repeated: sellout crowds, national media coverage, and a wave of new viewers discovering the sport for the first time. Inside the league, players recognized the change as well. Veterans who had spent their entire careers fighting for attention in a crowded sports marketplace suddenly found themselves playing in front of larger audiences than they had ever experienced. Younger athletes entering the league realized they were stepping into an environment that felt dramatically different from what it had been even a few seasons earlier. The increased visibility created new opportunities, but also new tensions. Growth always brings complicated questions about revenue sharing, league governance, marketing priorities, and the balance between individual stardom and collective identity. These questions became especially intense as the league's financial outlook began to shift. Media rights negotiations that once attracted modest interest suddenly involved billion-dollar valuations and long-term broadcast partnerships. Sponsors who had historically overlooked women's basketball started competing for brand placement, endorsement opportunities, and advertising space during games. The business conversation surrounding the league transformed almost overnight. What had once been a niche property within the sports industry was suddenly being discussed as a rapidly growing entertainment product with global potential. In that environment, every decision carried heightened significance. Labor negotiations between players and owners were no longer occurring within a small, relatively stable system. They were unfolding at the exact moment when the league's economic trajectory was accelerating. For veteran players who had endured years of limited compensation and minimal media attention, the timing felt like a long-awaited opportunity to secure the financial recognition they believed they deserved. Their argument was rooted in years of effort spent building the league's credibility and competitive standard. Without their dedication, the infrastructure supporting women's professional basketball would never have existed in the first place. At the same time, the explosive popularity surrounding Clark created a complicated layer to the discussion. When a single athlete becomes the focal point of massive audience growth, it inevitably reshapes the economic conversation. Networks invest more aggressively because they believe viewers will tune in to watch that specific player. Young players entering the sport are growing up with a new model for what is possible on the court. Broadcasters and sponsors are investing resources because they believe the audience for these games will keep expanding. It was not a moment of defeat or resentment. It was the complicated realization that the next chapter of women's basketball might look very different from the one that came before. As the league continues navigating its financial negotiations and structural changes, that underlying momentum will remain the defining factor. Fans who discovered women's basketball through Clark's college career are still watching. The generation that had built the league through years of persistence and resilience was now witnessing the arrival of a new figure who could carry that foundation into an era of unprecedented visibility. The reactions from those veterans suggested a recognition that the sport was evolving in real time. Sponsors align their marketing strategies with a star who attracts the most attention. Ticket sales spike whenever that athlete appears on the schedule. Even casual sports fans who previously ignored the league begin following it simply because they are curious about the phenomenon everyone is talking about. That reality does not diminish the value of the many other stars who make the league competitive and entertaining. Athletes like Aya Wilson, Breanna Stewart, and Diana Taurasi have delivered championship performances and unforgettable moments for years. Their skill, leadership, and dedication helped sustain the sport during times when national attention was far more limited. Yet the modern sports marketplace often operates according to a different set of rules than those that governed earlier eras. Attention tends to concentrate around the figures who capture the imagination of the largest audiences, and once that momentum begins, it can reshape entire industries. Clark's influence appears to be one of those rare forces. Her ability to combine elite skill with a style of play that feels dramatic, unpredictable, and entertaining has turned routine games into must-watch events. When she launches a shot from distances that once seemed unthinkable, the crowd rises in anticipation before the ball even leaves her hands. When she threads a pass through a defense that seemed perfectly positioned, the highlight spreads across social media within minutes. These moments are not simply impressive basketball plays. They are pieces of content that travel instantly across the global sports conversation. The practice session with Team USA captured that dynamic in a raw and unfiltered way. There were no television commentators narrating the action, no elaborate broadcast graphics, no carefully edited highlight packages. There were simply elite athletes sharing a court, running drills, and suddenly reacting with visible surprise when Clark began hitting shots from distances that forced everyone to reconsider what was possible in a structured practice setting. The silence that briefly settled over the gym spoke volumes. These were competitors who had faced the best players in the world. They rarely reacted so openly to a teammate's performance. Yet in that moment,